So the first question though that I would like to ask each of you to reflect over is this question of barriers, because you've all been presenting some pretty amazing and impressive stuff, and some of you talked about how it can be a barrier to students to actually. Or in the Slack, there's been questions about how can it be it can be a barrier for students to actually dare to come forward with their ideas for a pre-registration, for example, or how it can be scarier for students to commit their code and so on and so forth. So my first question here is sort of, with the stuff that you have been presenting, how do we work to get the barriers down so that it's not so scary? Does anybody want to start?
Okay, could I start? Maybe.
Yes,
Should I start as a student that finds everything very scary and intimidating? Well, I think the big thing is if it's done in sort of a classroom environment, it's always perceived as quite low risk, if that makes sense. Especially like if I have to, let's say, do a pseudo pre-registration to just my lecturer or my supervisor, it's sort of in-house and maybe a little bit less scary. And even if you take it to like the context of in a field course, like you can sort of lie to yourself in a way and think, okay, well, it's just within the field course environments and so on. So it feels like a slightly more controlled environment if you're in a sort of a classroom setting versus like you're doing your thesis and it's sort of this very big real world thing that you're doing. So I think that might also help, if that makes sense. Like to sort of have, like if you bring it in a teaching environment and not just in a research environment. But yeah.
So starting small. So Rob, you have had what did you say? More than 50 workshops around the world, right?
Yes, indeed.
In different languages. And so, what is your experience with sort of lowering barriers and making people engage?
I think that's a really good question, by the way, and I really enjoyed Tanya's response to this, to which I will add, not just because you stop being a student, that you stop being challenged or scared, by the way. So but in regards to Compadre, Comadre, and Padrino, one of the challenges that we have faced is the heavy mathematics that support the analysis of all of this information. So I can start talking to you guys about eigenvalues and eigenvectors and eigen stuff, and I can put you all, perhaps, or some of you, to sleep immediately. We've made mistakes in the past trying to engage with students using mathematics before biology. And so what we now do is we emphasize the biological relevance of these tools. We emphasize the biological predictive power of demography and population ecology. And if we have to, then we teach them a bit more about the mathematics. That's one. The other aspect, which I think was mentioned before in Slack, is that different languages interpret things differently. So la tasa de crecimiento poblacional may mean something completely different from the population growth rates in English. So being able to not translate word by words, depending on who your audience is, but to contextualize. And for that, you're required to really know who your target community is. That has proven to be quite useful.
Thank you. When you were giving your talk, Louise, then somebody was commenting on Slack that blogging is a nice way to remember, nice way to sort of to more or less as note taking, and that made me think about, well, if it's a nice way to remember, that's one of the things that students also should do. Could it also be like, could we use the blogs not only as a way to share knowledge from us to the students and maybe for the students back to us, but could it also be something that we could actually use in assessment of the courses? Could this be sort of the deliverable of students in a course? Could it be what we assess them on?
Yeah, of course, I believe that completely. And one of the things that I think it was in my slides is that blogs are updatable. So if something's not completely correct, or something's going the wrong way about solving a problem, we can fix it, and the consequences are not that serious. It's not going to be like a horrible rejection letter from a journal. It's just nice, friendly feedback, and then you can go back and fix whatever's wrong with either a blog done by students or even the own thing, the things we do. So I think
But
it's pretty good psychologically to have something sort of that informal as a tool.
but of course, the risk with this is that when you put it out there in the open, and that goes with many things, then you cannot guarantee who will interact with you. So another question is, have you had some unpleasant experiences in your blogging history?
Not particularly. I've had content sort of stolen and then passed off as someone else's, but that's not too negative towards me. For the most part, it's just constructive criticism.
And you talked about this learning curve. So this and for you as a course developer, and somebody was asking also on the Slack here, like when you have this development, and then of course for you it's a long learning curve, but for the students they come in on the latest step always. So are you able to sort of and several of you were also talking about how this whole open science universe creates so much additional content that the students need to be able to learn. So is this happening at the expense of the biology? Is it becoming too much? Is it too hard for people to follow it, or what sort of is the workload for the students increasing as the slope of the curve that you were plotting on? I guess that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, I guess in some way, but also, and all of these things like learning how to do GitHub and all of this is kind of scary for the students, and so they might maybe not get it or do it or whatever. But I think a lot of these open science elements in the course are kind of an additional thing for the students, so they don't need to do everything all the time. But I think also because they work in teams, and the students have different abilities, so maybe some students do more on the coding side, while other students are more focusing on writing an introduction or doing the data documentation part. So I think the students somehow have some freedom to choose what they want to take home from these parts. And then maybe also what Tanya mentioned, that we are kind of holding their hand while they do their first step. So we try to make it very easy for them. So we help them to set up a Git account if they want, because the first steps to get Git and RStudio working together can be quite tricky. So things like this. But I think we can probably do a lot more to make a lot of these steps easier for the students. Or we have a lot more ideas.
I wonder if we should channel Hannah if she's here.
I don't know if you'll be here. She might have fallen asleep.
Yes, that is understandable. Okay, so we will skip that. But do ask questions in the sort of also specific questions to the different presenters in the Slack channel. There's been discussions, both questions and discussions and tangents and all kinds of things happening on the Slack. So that's very nice. I will give sort of the presenters a round of last words before we go to coffee break. And the one thing that I would like to ask you to comment on is sort of what you have been showing us here is very sort of advanced, and you've been working on this for a long time, and it's really quite impressive. And we're talking about students being intimidated, but of course there could also be a teacher or two out there being slightly intimidated. So if people want to go sort of one step towards incorporating open science and fair practices in their teaching, how do you start? Where is the first step? So how should people go about that? And I think I'll take people in the order which I see them. So starting from that side with Rob.
So one of the ways to engage students in teaching is to also engage them in research. And this is also inspired by a question that was asked on the Slack channel by Christian Strom, who asks, how do you view the data citation as a means to credit and involve students in open science? If you take a look at the two papers that I mentioned before, Introduce and Compadre, that was published a few years ago in Journal of Ecology, and Comadre in the sister journal of the BES, Journal of Animal Ecology, you'll realize that the authorship line is really long. The first 10 to 15 names are my students. So we've taken a proactive action in trying to engage the work that the students helpers did in terms of digitizing, for which they were paid, by the way. These were not volunteer jobs, by also involving them in the research output. And what this has contributed, perhaps in a small manner, but a significant one, is some of them continuing their academic career. Some of them have landed assistant professorship jobs recently, or are doing Marie Curie fellowships around Europe.
Thank you. So involving the students in research is in your research is a good way to start, and then your practices are then you need them to adopt your practices. Okay, Lou, I'll take Tanya next. Advice to educators.
I'll be the student voice once again. I think a big thing is, as an educator, being open to, if your student approaches you with a new way, or suggests, oh, should we not move all our code to GitHub and work on GitHub, sort of as a supervisor or instructor, being open to adopting or learning about that, if that's something that you haven't worked with before. I've found quite often sometimes it's you as a student want to do this, and then your supervisor or the lecturer is sort of like, oh, I don't understand this, and they don't want to engage with it because it's quite scary, which is fine. But I think maybe being willing to sort of be taught by your student, if I could put it that way.
That's excellent.
So yeah, I think having an open mind from a bottom-up feedback, I guess, is probably the way to look at it.
Dare to learn from your students. That's great advice. Louise, what is your advice to us educators?
Yeah, for this, I think I'll draw on my experience as a mammalogist, working with some really old school taxonomy people. And in that case, I think what I would suggest is focusing on the incentives and on the positive consequences rather than all the latest technologies and programming stuff. More like saying you can get a bigger network of collaborators, or more citations, or more downloads, or anything positive that will come from being more open and reproducible without really being technical at all about it. I guess that's might be a good point for educators and researchers.
So don't forget why we're here. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. And then I have Hannah here, and she says, first step for learning about pre-registering. Write an analysis and a data collection plan, and just share it with the supervisor. Then check back on it regularly. It doesn't need to be binding, just a guide to keep people on track and on task. And if it sucks, you can just create a revised plan. But taking it stepwise and sharing with one person first and then the world later, I guess is. But actually doing these things, doing the things right, but sort of you don't have to share it with everybody first. I guess is a good piece of advice here. Oh, you're last.
I kind of agree with everybody that has shared their opinion by now. But maybe I think our example from the plant functional trait course is a good example. So we didn't incorporate everything. So I think if you're running an ecology course now, you don't have to change it from this year to the next year and incorporate all the ideas that you've heard here, but kind of take it step by step. And we started with the things that were most needed. So because the data quality was just very poor when we came out of the course. But I think also another important thing to add is like to not make the student write a pointless report or something at the end. Make them do something useful, something that is going somewhere, whether it is a blog post or a data paper or whatever, but something useful.